So in this video, I'm going to share some of the tools that I use to learn Bach's Partita number 6 in E minor, just the opening movement. And this is a piece I love very much, so I was very eager to dive into learning the notes. But my project here was to basically see if I could learn it in a very short space of time by adopting a make haste slowly approach and trying to learn as efficiently as possible. So the first step was actually to take a step back and do some basic analysis just to build a mental model of the piece to lay good foundations, which would hopefully make it quicker and easier for me to learn the notes. Now, I don't necessarily mean doing a formal textbook analysis. It can sometimes just be going through the score and noticing things that might be useful to you. So, for example, at a macro level, the piece is in ternary form, ABA. So it starts with this theme. And when it comes back, it's a fourth lower or in the dominant. So that was E minor, and now it comes back in B minor. So just noticing something like that is quite useful. Now, a knowledge of keyboard harmony is really good, but even just basic identification of chords can also help building that mental model. So, for example, this piece has loads of amazing seventh chords in it, this kind of thing. I mean, that sounds like jazz to me, and that's one of the things that I love about it. So being able to identify some of these seventh chords is really, I think, quite essential if you're going to play a piece like this. And so looking at this motif that comes in bar 3, and it's repeated in various guises throughout. So acknowledging that repetition and what the subtle variations are is also a really good step as well. But this is the motif. So if we just look at this, see the C as a passing note. Those are all different types of seventh chords. And then we've got seventh again just a little bit later. And then we also have diminished sevenths as well, used quite frequently. I mean, those are just minor thirds stacked on top of each other. So that's a basic harmonic analysis really useful for memorization. And then obviously these chords have different flavors and sounds, so that's musically important to notice as well. Then using a tool that Graham Fitch calls personalized pattern recognition. Really, it's just an approach to identifying patterns and then finding personally meaningful ways of describing them. So they don't necessarily need to be something formal that would be academically recognized. It could just be something that's useful to you. And so, for example, in this most, I noticed something interesting here is that the first note of each group goes up a fourth, and then it does it again. But it's actually going down, it's going up a fourth and then down a second. So, and then an augmented fourth. That's quite useful to know. It comes back later, does a very similar thing, but then goes up a fourth again, up a fourth again. That's later in the return of the A section. Then there's a bit where you've got that similar theme again in bar 15, but instead of going down seconds or up fourths, it's going up semitones. And there's one where it goes down from starting on E. So that already is filling in, allowing us to memorize quite a large part of the piece. Then there's places where it's quite useful to combine those things. For example, in bar 78, there's a bit of a tricky passage, quite a long passage in the left hand, which goes like this. if I look at the first note of each of the semiquaver groups, I have a diminished seventh, descending, starting on C. So, and then another one starting on G, and then D. So, and by just having that kind of, that skeleton, or those notes as anchors, I can then look at just try and memorizing what the patterns of the notes are, the shape of the notes are in between those, but I've already got something that is quite easy to fill out. So with a bit of analysis done, I basically thought then, well, yeah, I'm ready to dive into learning the notes. And the way that I did this firstly was I divided the piece up into sections, and I started with some of the more difficult spots first. And that was really useful because not only did it avoid this problem of, it's so common where you have somebody playing and things start off really well and progressively get worse because they've literally learned the piece from start to finish, and the start has had far more attention than the finish. It avoids that, but it also means that you end up with points that you can pick up from. So if anything goes wrong in performance, there's just a lot of security in knowing that there's places that you can very easily start from. Rather than getting stuck halfway through the, I mean, I've seen this before as well, and it's kind of happened to me too. So you get stuck halfway through the piece or even towards the end, and then the only way of picking it up to finish it is to start all over again. It's just not a great experience for anyone. So looking at learning the actual notes, one of the tools that I used was, instead of separate hand practice, it was separate voice practice, and then what Graham Fitch calls a step ladder, where you put the voices together. So if I look at bar 34 as an example to illustrate this, this is where things start to get a bit trickier because you have all three voices going at the same time and some nice little redistributions in across the hands. So I'll first start by playing the soprano voice, which has the subject. Now let's do the alto. And you'll notice there I'm using the fingerings and the hand redistribution that I will ultimately use when I put it together. That's really important because that's really key to this process. Then the bass. Now I can start putting them together. So let's look at the top two voices together. Okay, and then the bottom two voices. Those are relatively straightforward. The outer voice is a little bit more difficult. It takes a little bit of thinking. Let me see if I can get that right. Okay, that part is actually not so difficult to do. There's other places where it's really tricky. And then I can put them together. It's so tempting to go on. What I found with that is that it's really cognitively difficult at first, and you really have to concentrate. But then, and it felt like it was really slow progress, having to think out what each fingering needs to be when you're playing it separately. But when I've put it all together at a later stage in the process, I was amazed at how quickly it all came together and also how well I knew it. And it's not just useful in terms of the note learning, but also musically, because it means that you have a really innate awareness of what each of the voices are doing. So that just opens up so many possibilities for shaping and creating something that's musically meaningful. Some other tools that I used as well were in some of the tricky spots. So this is something I'm going to find quite difficult to demonstrate on camera because I find it difficult to do in the best of circumstances, is miming a voice. And what that is you put your fingers on the keys, but you don't play them. And you can choose different ones to play or different combinations to mime. So if I take bar 34 again, let's just say I was going to mime the bass, I would do this. So that's one way of doing it. You could do other voices or combinations thereof just to mix things up. And what that also does is it forces you to think about every note. So you're not just using your muscle memory and your autopilot, which I think can become very detrimental towards. I think often when we find that I've certainly encountered this where I learn a piece and it all holds together quite nicely when I'm learning it, and then a few weeks later, even after practicing it quite consistently, I find that I'm just making mistakes in all sorts of places, and that's where I'm using this autopilot. I've gotten lazy and I've kind of forgotten a lot of what I'd picked up in the learning process. Another thing that is quite useful is to do things like controlled stops. Now that's really useful for note learning and accuracy, but also to avoid that going into autopilot mode, because you can use the stops to think about what next, but also just you can put them in different places just to shake things up and sort of keep your mind engaged. So an example of that, for example, I could go from bar 37, stop. What I'm doing there is I'm putting a stop in or a rest in just after the third beat, but you can change the places, or you can do something like this. And there's so many combinations that one can do to keep engaged and keep practicing interesting. So there you have some of the tools that I used for learning this piece. I hope you found that interesting. And although these tools are quite specific in some cases to contrapuntal music like this, many of them can be applied more broadly. So I'd encourage you to give them a try on some of the pieces you're learning, and I really hope you find them useful.